Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a very exciting and enlightening book talk this afternoon. My name is Andrew Lapin. I am a senior reporter with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And my guest today is the author Seth Stern. He has written a new book that is delightfully titled Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, Holocaust Survivors on South Jersey Poultry Farms. And the book just came out last week, and so we're very excited to have him here for his first official book talk event. And there's a lot to get into, and certainly it's a timely book, as anyone preparing for Passover knows. This is chicken and egg season, when Jews are suddenly, very concerned with having enough chickens, enough eggs, and so maybe we'll get some tips along those lines as well. But Seth Stern is a legal journalist and editor at Bloomberg Industry Group. He previously reported for Bloomberg News, Congressional Quarterly, and the Christian Science Monitor. He co-authored Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion. And so, Seth, I would love to start out because I think it's important that people know that when you're telling the story of these Holocaust survivors who came to America and started poultry farms, you're really telling your own family's story. This is the story of your grandparents. So to start off, can you tell us a bit about them and their journey?
Sure. And let me just start off by thanking you, Andrew, and Rebecca, and JTA and 70 Faces Media for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about the book. And like you say, it is my family story. My grandparents were survivors. They came over. They were displaced persons. They came over. They were in New York a few months, and they wound up on a poultry farm in New Jersey from 1947 till my mother graduated high school in 1964. I started talking to my grandmother back in 1998 when I was in law school over lunch, asking her about her life story. And it was this part of the story, how they wound up with 1,000 other Holocaust survivors, most of whom had grown up in big cities or mid-sized cities and never in their lives farmed before. How did they wind up on raising chickens in southern Jersey? So that's what I set out to explore in this book.
And it's a history that I personally had no idea that this had happened, that there was this community of survivors of refugees who started these farms, and so tell me more, because and I'll say as well that for those listening at home, if you have a question for Seth, please leave it in the chat and we'll try to get to it later in the hour. But when you go over your family, your grandparents' history and their journey over and how they survived, like that feels like such a crucial element here of the story you're telling. So can you kind of fill in those details and why poultry farms and what, how did this happen for them?
Right. Well, the title, as you mentioned, is Speaking Yiddish to Chickens. And that comes from the fact that so many of the survivors in oral history interviews joked that part of the appeal of becoming a poultry farmer was that the chickens didn't mind if you spoke Yiddish to them. And that's because most of these survivors, they came to the United States, they didn't know English. Most had little or no money. The war had interrupted their education if they had any formal high school or college education. And so they didn't have many opportunities when they came here. And there was tremendous appeal in this idea of being your own boss. You might have been in captivity or confinement for years. And the appeal of a quiet life in the country where you could sort of have your own place and be your own boss was very appealing. And so, as in my family's case, when they saw an ad in the Yiddish paper in New York, or heard mostly through word of mouth about the opportunity that the Jewish Agricultural Society, a Jewish philanthropy, would help them buy a farm, a lot of people jumped at it. Now, of course, they had absolutely no idea what was involved in raising thousands of chickens. And that it was actually a very difficult business and lifestyle. But initially, there was tremendous appeal in the opportunity.
Let's get into some of that historical context here. You mentioned the Jewish Agricultural Society. This is a really fascinating group. What were they? How did they get started? And why were they so interested in compelling Jews to start farms?
The story I tell here is part of a broader story of Jewish American agriculture. I think a lot of people, when I tell them I've been working on this, sort of Jews farm, and the truth is Jews have always farmed in this country. Starting in the 1880s, you had these sort of idealists in Eastern Europe and Russia and the Pale of Settlement, and they viewed collective farming as a way out and a way to sort of reimagine what a Jew could be. And they came over and created these agricultural colonies in many parts of the countries. Most of them failed spectacularly. A few had modest success in southern New Jersey, in part because of the proximity to New York and Philadelphia and the nearby railway lines. And it was assisted by the philanthropy was Baron de Hirsch, was a German-born Jewish financier in Europe, and he devoted a lot of his fortune to helping Jewish immigrants settle as farmers, mostly in South America and North America. First, in these colonies, collective agriculture didn't really work out, but the Jewish Agricultural Society had more success helping Jews settle on individual family-owned farms. And you had these sort of scattered throughout the country, and there was a time when Jews farmed in all 48 then existing states. But the clusters and the most success, they were dairy and poultry farmers in the Berkshires down through Connecticut, the Catskills, and into northern, central, and then ultimately southern New Jersey.
How many Jewish farmers are we talking about here, and what was sort of their, what was their peak, and was there a sort of dropping off point for this appeal?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it. I mean, the typical Jewish immigrant in the United States settled in cities. If they settled in rural America, it was more likely they did so as a peddler, selling whatever they could carry, and then ultimately opening dry goods stores. And that was throughout rural America, whether Appalachia, Gold Rush, California, the Mississippi Delta. That was the more typical trajectory in rural America. But we're talking about in the thousands, maybe 2% of Jewish immigrants might have wound up on farms, some of them abandoning it, some of them staying put. But that's sort of the scale. I don't want to overstate it to say there was a hidden majority on farms, but there was a substantial number, and it's sort of a little known story. And just to continue the story with the Jewish Agricultural Society, they were helping refugees who had come from Germany and Austria in the 30s during the Depression. They viewed farming as particularly appealing as an option because every Jew settled on a farm was one less person viewed as taking jobs away from people in cities. And so they helped settle in the hundreds, 100, 200, 300 German and Austrian Jewish refugees in South Jersey, in part because the land there was cheaper than in central Jersey, northern Jersey, or the Catskills. And then once the war ended and the displaced persons started to arrive, they picked right back up and assisted families like mine.
And so you're making this point that, the Jewish Agricultural Society as an organization, which I believe they also publish a magazine called The Jewish Farmer, right? Which is I find very charming. But they actually predate the war. They are resettling pre-war Jewish refugees. That is sort of the foundations of their mission. And then when the survivors come, and there's this new wave of refugees, some of whom, are choosing to resettle on farms. You described there's some of this culture clash between kind of the previous generation of Jewish farmers and the new generation of Jewish farmers, which, mirrors some of what was happening in other parts of the country between different Jewish populations as well. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I try to get at sort of the group dynamics, and the community where this South Jersey settlement was anchored was a Vineland, New Jersey, which was a city of roughly 30,000 people, halfway between Atlantic City and Philadelphia, very much a rural character. And those initial, I had mentioned the colonies, the Eastern European Jews sort of gravitated to Vineland as the colonies failed, and they were looking for better schools for their kids. And then, so that was the first wave. And by after the war, they were the establishment. Their children had gone into the professions and started going to Ivy League schools. Then came the German Jewish refugees. And then this third contingent were the Eastern Europeans who nicknamed themselves or got nicknamed Greena, the idea of the greenhorn. And yeah, it was the dynamics. The German Jews felt like they weren't welcomed by the pre-existing Eastern European Jewish community in this area. And then the survivors didn't feel welcome by either of the prior two waves. And it's sort of the reverse of the dynamic in New York, where the German Jews came first and looked down on the Eastern European Jews. In Vineland, the Eastern European Jews the German Jews felt they were looked down upon. Now, teasing out how much of that was their own perceptions, their own sort of insecurities versus and just people not knowing, like anywhere else in the country, knowing how to what exactly to say to people who had survived these just horrific experiences. So I try to untangle it a bit, but ultimately it's very hard to know how much was they were actually mistreated, how much of it was people saying the wrong thing, and how much of it was their own sort of keeping to themselves. And I think there were elements of all of the above.
So you mentioned that in the book, you talk about how a lot of these survivors who were electing to start these poultry farms, like, were lying about the amount of farming experience they had, and they were sort of, or greatly embellishing it, right? So paint a picture for us. What would this experience have been like for these Jews, coming and sort of being told, okay, you're a farmer now, you have to, learn how to raise chickens. Like, tell us about that.
I mean, I would say first off on the notion of, the lying to some extent. I mean, unfortunately, that was consistent with so much of that. They had to be less than honest about their age during the war to survive. You had to act like you were able to come off as if you were working age rather than too young or too old and get sent to your death. After the war, in terms of how the immigration laws were set up in this country, you sort of had a lie went about where you might have been born to hit the right quota. And it's an unfortunate reality. You just had to not always be truthful, these sort of white lies. In terms of the farming experience, the Jewish Agricultural Society and the other groups that were helping, they knew that these potential farmers didn't have much agricultural experience. And those that came to their farms, it was a real culture shock. It was a culture shock in terms of moving to a small town like Vineland. And I should say the survivors also settled in other communities in Connecticut and Southern California and elsewhere. I don't want to make it sound like South Jersey was it, but the largest concentration, the largest number did settle in South Jersey. And in all of these places, it was a real culture shock. And they had to learn to farm. They had to figure it out for themselves. They had, as you mentioned, a Jewish farmer. It was a monthly Yiddish and English. It was published in both Yiddish and English. But a lot of it was just figuring it out on your own. The people who might have come before you, the other displaced persons, would help you, some of the other farmers. But it was tough. Raising chickens is hard. All agriculture is hard. So much is out of your control. The weather, the commodities markets that set prices. Chickens get sick. Chickens crowd together in coops and sort of wind up smothering each other. They could peck each other. They could be cannibals. I mean, it could be very unpleasant, and just the days were long. You had to wake up early to make sure they had water and that their water hadn't frozen, and they needed to get fed all day. And you had to do this 7 days a week, and it was hard to get a vacation. It was a tough life. There was a disconnect between, I think, the dream of a bucolic, easy lifestyle and the reality of just the hard life that farming is.
And at least the families that you profile, it sounds like they didn't particularly enjoy farming. Maybe some of them did. Maybe you can elaborate.
I think there was tremendous variety in so much of what people found in the life. Some people, it was the best time of their lives in America. They loved being in this community among fellow survivors in this rural place. And I could speak to what a unique rural place it was in Jewish America. But some people really loved it. Some people hated the isolation. Some people liked having the buffer of their own. Having a 10-acre farm was, for some people, a lot better than being in a tenement in New York. So it was tremendous variation, but no one found it easy, that's for sure. And as the 50s went on and the economics of chicken farming changed and the rise of the mega farms in the South, if you were a poultry farmer in South Jersey with 3,000 or 5,000 chickens, you found it impossible to compete with 100,000 or more. The scale of agriculture just changed, and it was very hard to compete. So it turned out to be a terrible business, even if you might have liked the lifestyle, the rural lifestyle.
Right, right. And I do want to come back to that, how this sort of chapter, ends. But first, let's talk about, your own grandparents. They were not settling alone. They were actually like cohabitating. It was almost like a communal farm, with some fellow survivors who came over at the same time. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, this sounds a lot like a kibbutz. Can you talk about this communal farming?
Yeah, my grandmother, remarkably, one of her best childhood friends survived the war. After the war, they reconnected in their hometown of Lublin. My grandparents survived in a forest. Her friend survived in hiding, basically passing, and she met her husband after the war in Lublin, had survived a camp and was in also sort of a partisan. So they sort of the range of experiences. They my mother and their daughter was born a couple weeks apart. They traveled together to a displaced persons camp in Germany and then came on the same boat to the United States. And they decided to buy a farm together. This wasn't unusual. These survivors didn't have enough money necessarily to buy a farm on their own, even with the assistance of philanthropies. And so they would pool their resources. This often worked out terribly. People who had very little in common besides a common desire for a farm, it ended in acrimony, and the agencies were very reluctant to encourage joint farming. My grandparents and this other family, the Liverants, they lived together for 4.5 years. They raised their daughters essentially as twins. They functioned as a single household, and it's remarkable. And my mother and their daughter continue to be friends, and it's a friendship that spanned 2 generations and nearly a century. So it is remarkable, but it wasn't easy for them either to be 2 households in one 3-room farmhouse. Each family had its own coops, but it wasn't easy. But it ended. It went better than others where there was so much sort of discord and acrimony, and usually they split up with a lot of ill will.
Mm. Paint a picture of Vineland as a community, because this is kind of like, it sounds a little bit like the prototypical like small town Jewish life. So talk about that.
Sure. As I might have mentioned, it's a community of about 30,000 people, halfway between Atlantic City and Philadelphia. It was close enough you could take a bus, even in the 50s, to Philly to commute, but it still had a very rural character. It was about a century old. It was sort of almost a precursor of suburban planning. The founder, Charles Landis, had these street grids and encouraged factories and farms, and very specific about how close trees could be planted. It had very much primarily an Italian-American character. Italian-American immigrants had settled there as truck farmers, growing vegetables and fruits. And by the 50s, the mayors were Italian, and a lot of the businesses were owned by Italians. There were factories where you had food processing and glass making and clothing. And then you had the agriculture. So it's sort of a multi-dimensional economy. But it was a very unique place in rural Jewish America. As I mentioned, Jews had always settled in rural America. But by the 1940s, after the war, most rural Jewish communities were beginning to shrink. As with everyone else in rural America, people were moving to cities. Jews in most places were beginning to move city to suburb. And yet, because of the survivor influx, the Jewish community in Vineland was growing, and it was already robust with multiple synagogues and kosher butcher shops, kosher delis and bakeries. There was Jewish radio shows over on the weekend, on Sunday mornings. And so it was already a very robust, and then they added to that. They infused sort of additional, these survivors, they created their own shtibels they built by hand, little synagogues that were in walking distance from their farms for those who didn't want to drive on Shabbat. They built their own mutual aid society combined with a social club, with the idea of a landsmanschaft that were typical in big cities earlier in the 20th century. And they had Passover dances and Purim parties for kids, and they had all these Yiddish performers come from from New York. Poets and playwrights and comedians would perform at the local schools, because that's the only place where you could fit hundreds of people. And it would be standing room only crowds to see the great stars of the Yiddish stage, who sadly were displaced persons often themselves, and they would travel wherever the sort of the remnants of Yiddishkeit had scattered in America. And they had a Yiddish lending library at the Veterans of Foreign Wars where you could borrow books. It was the great classics translated into Yiddish. So it was a really I try to sort of depict this place that was very much unique and very much, it was a moment in time that's passed. There's very little of that left there, but hopefully I give a picture of what it was like at the time.
Yeah, no, that is so fascinating, that that sort of sense of community. And we should say that, like, even though your family, your grandparents, had this farm in Vineland, like you yourself were not raised there. Tell us how you, I guess, decided to tell this story, how you engaged or what kind of relationship you had with your grandparents growing up, and sort of how you were able to dig up all these details about what these communities were like.
I set out in 1998 to interview my grandmother, I think with the idea to preserve my family history. Did I think maybe a book would come of it? I don't know. I think, so I started interviewing her, and every time I was home, at the time my grandmother lived close to my parents, and I would see her all the time when I was home from school and just interview her. It was harder for her, obviously, to talk about the war, easier to talk about the farm. And I just was so fascinated by this story. I started interviewing my mother and then expanded out the research. And I should say this book simply wouldn't have been possible without so many survivors, and more so the children of survivors, who were so generous with their time, their memories, their photos. They welcomed me into their homes. So it just wouldn't have been possible without them. And then I did a lot of archival research. The Jewish Agricultural Society's records are at the Center for Jewish History in New York. I was able to get the case files of my family from the United Service for New Americans, which was the relief agency that helped, with Hayes, that helped the DPs come to the United States. So I got their case file, and I went through the local newspaper sort of year by year, and the Jewish Farmer and Poultryman, which was a poultry industry newspaper published in Vineland. So it was just a combination of sort of historical research and journalistic interviews.
I'll put in a plug as well for oral histories with your grandparents, folks on this call. If you still have living older relatives, I can attest that you find some really great stories when you sit down with them and ask them about their lives. Sometimes you get whole books out of it. It's a great little trip down memory lane. So what happened to the farms? You were alluding to this. How do we track the trajectory here of the rise of the mega farming and kind of what wound up happening to these poultry farms?
The period of influx that was about from 1948, the Displaced Persons Act sort of allowed for more refugees to come in 50. So from like 48 to 52, there was this surge. It was roughly 1,000 survivors, 500 families, more or less. There's no official tally. And things were pretty good in the early 50s, particularly the Korean War. Egg prices went up because of the war and the need for protein, and people working in factories had more money. So there were some good years at the beginning, but by the mid-50s, egg prices started to plummet, and that continued pretty much through the end of the decade. And as the decade went on, more and more of these farmers they just couldn't make a living. So either they, as in the case of my grandmother, who went to work in one of the local textile clothing factories, some of the families, the wife or the husband, would seek a second income off the farm. But increasingly, they abandoned farming altogether, and they couldn't even sell the farms in some instances. There were simply no buyers. Some of the families went into ancillary businesses related to agriculture, poultry. One of the big, Vineland Poultry was one of the big slaughterhouses for kosher chickens up until relatively recently. And then others started small businesses, or might have had a motel or a hotel in South Jersey and Atlantic City, or they left altogether and sought, as ultimately my family did. They moved to Brooklyn. So there was sort of a scattering as people sought opportunities elsewhere.
When you think back about that period, does the fact that these did not become, legacy farms, do you think these farms were like failures, or is that not the right way to frame it?
I think that's the right way to frame it. I think even if they were successful, it's unlikely you would have had the farms carry over to a second generation. These refugees had the same aspirations for their children as every other Jewish American family. They wanted their children to go into business, to go get a degree, go into a profession. So I don't think, maybe some would have, but I don't think you would have seen a lot of second generation farms anyway. I don't think that this was it wasn't successful in terms of economics. Was it any worse of an opportunity than they would have had in New York or elsewhere, given what capital they had and the education they had? Not necessarily. And for many people, it was a nice sense of community. It was a place to sort of become American and raise your children. So some people regretted going to the farms and others didn't. It varied. I think from the perspective of the Jewish Agricultural Society and looking through the records and the public statements, one thing I did that struck me is the degree to which they didn't really acknowledge that things were not working. As the 50s went on, the officials, they just kept up with these optimistic, things are going to turn around, even when it was clear to everyone else, like structurally, this just didn't work. Small family farms couldn't compete. In part, I think the Jewish Agricultural Society, so many people who had worked there had been there so long, and they were so committed to the idea of Jewish farming that perhaps it was hard for them to see that it didn't necessarily work. But I don't view it as a failure in the broader sense, even if farming didn't work out as a viable business.
We should also say, like, let's give people a sense of like what the other options were, right, available to survivors, right, because they were entering a country that had all of these, anti-Semitic immigration quotas, even to get them, like into the country. And then, if people were not farming, like what were they doing, and like how were they thinking about that choice?
Right. The first jobs, these were not, and ultimately many, I don't want to make it sound as if they were forever limited. People went on and had tremendous variation, and some had great success. But yeah, as a first job, whether it was a laborer in a store or in a factory, the opportunities or the options, if you were a DP in New York, weren't great. There was a housing shortage in the late 40s after the war. So it's really, you have to compare to what the other opportunities actually were rather than sort of the theoretical.
Yeah. And was there an appeal also, do you think, to the fact that, like, if you had a farm, you kind of owned your farm and you were a bit of, it was like your own boss situation, what would that sort of appeal have been like for, survivors?
I think there was tremendous appeal, this idea, if you had been in captivity or confinement, or in my grandparents' case, had lived in a forest for a year and a half underground. The idea of having your own space, a buffer, there was a certain appeal for many to that, to having 10 acres of a farm. Well, you're sharing with 3,000 or 5,000 hens. I don't want to make it sound like it was this idyllic paradise. But that was certainly appealing. Some, on the other hand, found it tremendously isolating. They just found being by themselves on a farm not to their liking, having grown up in cities or used to sort of density and being surrounded by people. So it varied.
Let's talk about the cultural clash, even between, beyond like Jewish spaces. There were also, like, this is rural America, right? And so you're not only dealing with kind of the more traditional or generational farmers, but also you talk a bit in the book about like the farm hands who were coming in from Puerto Rico or elsewhere, and there would be some conflicts that could come up from that. Could you talk about that?
This was an important source of labor. These farmers, they couldn't do all of it themselves, even with their children's help or their spouse's help. So they needed help, and they didn't have enough money for really high quality help. So what often was the case is these laborers, agencies in Philadelphia or Baltimore would send men who were often, had down on their luck. They might have been alcoholics. They gave them $1 and a bus ticket, shipped them off to Vineland to be farmhands, and the farmers would complain about that they weren't reliable, that they would disappear, and I mean, it was a difficult dynamic. Also, the conditions weren't great. They were often the farmhands were living in the coops, or so it was a difficult dynamic between farmhand and farmer. A lot of them were Black, or there was an influx of Puerto Rican migrants who had come to work on the truck farms with the fruit and vegetable picking. Some of them wound up on the poultry farms. Some of them had good experiences, some didn't. But it was a difficult dynamic. There were instances of violence by farm laborers. The farm laborers complained of exploitation, which certainly isn't unique to South Jersey at all. But yeah, it's another dimension of the story.
And these poultry farmers would also encounter anti-Semitism at times, right? Including sometimes from like other Jewish farmers who had certain beliefs about what the more recent refugees were doing.
Yeah, the dynamics that was part of not feeling welcome, the sense that the survivors in oral histories, and it was decades later, so you have to take it with that caveat, but recalled the comments, why only prisoners have had tattoos on their arms, or just showed at best a complete lack of compassion on the part of Jewish Americans who had survived, who had lived in the United States and had no notion of what the survivors had gone through. There were, yes, certainly sort of stereotypes about the Grina, that they were hardened or only the worst kind of person had survived. And this was not just in Vineland. You look at oral histories and books in other rural Jewish communities had the same sort of misperceptions or stereotypes about what survivors were like. So they certainly had to deal with that. There was some anti-Semitism. Some of it was like rural jokes. They would decide to light a cross on fire, they said, as a joke, these young guys in their teens or 20s, and they didn't realize it was a refugee's farm, and how horrifying that was. What's amazing is the local paper there, the Vineland, what was then called the Vineland Times Journal, was owned by a Jewish family, and the editor, Ben Luchter, showed just tremendous compassion. I try to tell that story too. There was a perception in the 50s that American Jews didn't care or didn't know about survivors or treated them as a non-entity. And he just, the way he covered in the newspaper, the local paper, with the sort of vivid and compassionate detail, admonishing the local community, to explain what it was like, if, from their perspective, to have a cross burned on their lawn. So that's and the dynamics with the Italian American community. Sometimes there were instances of anti-Semitism. There are also instances of Italian American residents going out of their way to help the refugees. So there was a great variation, and I don't want to give the impression that they were living in this hostile environment.
Yeah. And I'm curious, the eggs that they were harvesting, were they just selling them locally, or was there like a wider distribution network?
No, this was a wider distribution at the time. Something like 1 in 5 eggs in the New York market were supplied in New Jersey. So primarily these eggs were serving, that was why it made so much sense to have a farming community there. You could serve the Philadelphia market, the New York market. There was a whole process. You had to look at the eggs, candling, which you held them up and see if there was blood spots or if they were okay. And then you had to weigh them and put them in the crates, whether they were medium, large, small. And then there were businessmen who would come around and collect them, and were the middlemen to wholesalers. There was also I'm blanking on it was a local collective that would try to get a good price as well. But yeah, these were not for local consumption. This was to sell in big cities.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why, once we start seeing like big agribusiness, which maybe you can talk about, like that's why these smaller family farmers were getting kind of shoved out during that period, right?
Yeah, just the scale of agriculture changed. It wasn't just in eggs, but you can see that across American agriculture in this era. But yeah, so where you could have 3,000 or 5,000 hens, and some people were raising chickens to sell for meat, called broilers, but a lot of them were doing eggs. You needed to sort of break even, given the price of eggs, you would need 100,000 eggs. The scale to make it work just was very difficult if you didn't have a lot of capital. And it's ironic that the great sort of king of that era of mass egg farming actually was a survivor in California, had something like 1 million or 2 million chickens, just to give you a sense of the ultimate scale of egg farming. And it was such a large operation, it apparently stunk up the entire county. Because, I mean, chickens, the feathers and the waste, I mean, again, it's a tough, unpleasant odors and waste and everything else.
Yeah, my goodness. I feel like I can imagine the smell just now. We had a question in the chat about why didn't, given that chicken farming was so difficult, why didn't some of these families diversify their crops? Maybe once they had settled in, was that any more of a, attractive offer?
Well, some diversified. They would do like a wholesale broken eggs and sell those to bakeries in big tin cans. So there were ways to do sort of related businesses or chicken vaccines. But the truth was, if you had 10 acres, it was a lot compared to living in a New York tenement, but that wasn't a plot where you can successfully have a herd of cattle or raise crops on a scale to make that a successful family farm. So that wasn't really an option. These were relatively small farms and not of a scale that you could diversify into other forms of agriculture. They didn't really consider that an option at the time.
Yeah. I'm curious about how observant were these Jews, how, sort of plugged into Jewish culture were they? And, because you describe how chicken farming is really like all hands on deck 7 days a week. And so, were they doing things like observing the Sabbath? Were they finding opportunities to, express their Judaism even within this very regimented farming lifestyle?
Very much so. I think that their Jewish identity was really central to their identity. How much they were observant, that varied. And I try to make the point, I hope it comes across in the book, about the survivors weren't a monolith. They varied so much in their religious observance, their coping, their material success. But in terms of religious observance, yeah, there was great variation, but I think being Jewish was important to them. The Yiddish culture, as I mentioned, building these small shuls where they could practice, and whether it was out of a sense that this religious practice was a connection to their lost families, or whether because they really still were deeply observant, that varied too. But their Jewish identity was central. They created the Landsmannschaft I mentioned was the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, and it had events for Lag BaOmer and Purim and Hanukkah and Passover. There were, before they built the little shuls, they would organize little services for the high holidays in a local firehouse that was near their farms. So again, it really was central, but there was also a tremendous variation.
Yeah, and I think that is a really interesting point. I mentioned earlier that it kind of sounded like a kibbutz, what you're describing. This was also the period where there were growing kibbutzim in Israel, larger communal farms, but still sort of rooted in agriculture and Jewish practice. Is there something there to tease out about maybe the traditional relationship between Jews and farming, and have we lost some of that in urbanizing? And can you talk about that?
I was fortunate to speak with Jonathan Deckel-Chen, who is a professor in Israel, who happened to be, while I was working this at Rutgers, looking at the history of Jewish agriculture in New Jersey, and asked him about that parallel. The closer parallel might be the moshavim rather than the kibbutz, in the sense that you had individual ownership and and sort of the family, the nuclear families were intact. But there's certainly a parallel in that sense of collective mission, collectively advertising, collectively buying supplies and trying to sell their eggs together. So there was certainly a collectivism, not in the formal sense as in Israel. as time went on and the sort of success and the paths varied, I think that sense of collectivism broke down a little bit or began to fray. This really was in the United States. There are Jewish farms. You could look in the late 60s and the counterculture, and people were drawn to agriculture in places like Vermont, for instance. So I don't want to make it sound like these were the last Jewish farmers in America. That's certainly not the case. There continue to be. But in terms of a mass wave on the scale of thousands of people, I don't think there's been anything on the scale since.
Yeah, and we should say yes, even today, right? There are Jewish farmers, and I recently, had egg on my face, no pun intended, when I visited a Jewish farmer in Vermont and made some comment like, "Oh, there aren't too many Jewish farmers out there," and he said, "What are you talking about? There's plenty of Jewish farmers," and it's something that people might just not be aware of, and there are still some communal farms out there as well. I mean, did you do any research into sort of like present day Jewish farming and how Jewish farming might have like survived this particular moment?
I can't claim to be an expert on the modern era of Jewish farming, but it's interesting, even in the community where I focused, one of the original colonies was called the Alliance Colony. And the descendants of that, one of the founding families is roughly my age or my sort of a contemporary, has tried to revive farming on his family's property there. So it's just one instance of an effort to engage in Jewish agriculture. And I'm on a couple Facebook groups just to see that. And you see that all over the country, sort of Jewish farming efforts. But I'm hardly an expert on the scale of it or the scope of it.
Yeah. What were you told? I mean, growing up, what was the family conversation like about these farms, and how were your grandparents remembering that time in their lives?
I think that they generally, and this is certainly what my grandmother transmitted to me, was that it was a hard life, but she enjoyed it. She had largely fond memories of this period in her life, even if it wasn't easy. My mom's sort of memories, it's a mix of the idyllic, her picture of holding a baby chick in her hand is still on her shelf at home, with the dangerous sort of remembering my grandfather's rifle to chase away or have to shoot the wild animals who would come and try to kill and eat the chickens. So, but she had very warm memories of growing up in this community and sort of the unique rural dimension to her childhood.
And what happened to the Jewish Agricultural Society? Did it die with this sort of, with the end of this particular movement?
Yeah, its end came pretty much in the late 60s, early 70s. The Baron de Hirsch Fund absorbed whatever remaining functions. But by the 60s, it wasn't, no one was seeking, there weren't the same influx of Jewish immigrants at that point. And if they were coming, they weren't seeking out help to buy a farm. So by the late 60s and early 70s, they sort of shut down, and whatever functions like helping the children of farmers get scholarships to college was absorbed by the Baron de Hirsch Fund in the early 1970s.
This was a group that, like, as you described, when it started out, it had a very philosophical mission statement about why it felt it was important for Jews to start farms. Like, they thought this was going to be a symbol of like self-reliance, right, for the Jewish people, and like hoping that this would help them integrate better with American society. And when you look at the scope of what this group was trying to do, what do you think the legacy of this push to get Jews involved in agriculture was?
It was very idealistic. It was this notion, and part of it was born out of a desire to combat anti-Semitism, the idea that they were going to show that Jews could live other than urban dwellers, that they could live off the land, and they were more fully American, or not just beyond the sort of traditional stereotype of Jews. And that was part of the mission, or the idea at the outset, at least. I think as time went by, they got a little more practical minded, but in terms of the survivors, they were willing to support people. You could see in the meeting notes that there was ambivalence about, was this really the best solution for people who largely had no idea how to farm? So they were ambivalent about it, but I guess they were so committed to Jewish farming and so committed to finding a way anyway to help the survivors that they thought this would be a good solution.
They were giving out loans, but were they helping instruct, these people about how to farm?
Yeah, there was a second mortgage, usually a function almost like a guarantor of the mortgage. But yeah, they would offer assistance. They had local agents who would go around, and then they gave more formal classes as time went on. Way back in their 20s and 30s and earlier, they had schools, sort of farming schools, where people could come and learn. So yeah, they tried to formally help and train. And in terms of the legacy, I mean, again, I don't think if the goal was to create a permanent class of Jewish farmers, that wasn't success. If it was a way to find a way station for Jewish immigrants, just sort of an alternate path from the traditional one in cities, they succeeded in that way.
Yeah, and certainly that seems like it was an admirable goal in its own right, even if it didn't create this Jewish farming class in America. People are probably curious now, I think, with the rising price of eggs, in the news a lot lately, and as I said earlier, like the significance of eggs to many Passover diets. Talk about like the significance of like how dependent these farmers were on commodities prices, on egg prices, and like how that economy would trickle down to affect their lives.
This is typical again too for farmers, but they would look in the newspaper. This is well before the internet. The Vineland newspaper was an afternoon paper or on the radio, and every day it gave the price of eggs that were set far off. It was completely out of their hands. I quote one farmer basically saying when there was a good price, there was no eggs because the chickens would be sick. And then if the chickens were healthy, the egg price would be bad. So they just felt this lack of control, which is not different. I mean, the scale of agriculture today is different, but you look at the bird flu killing millions of chickens today, it's still the case where whether it's health or weather is what determines so much in chicken farming and any other form of farming. But it's been a long time, obviously. But yeah, the idea when I buy eggs, I think about what the price of eggs was or what they would get for it in the 50s, and I wonder what they would have thought to know that a dozen eggs, could be $6 or more now. I think that would have been mind-boggling. It also probably would have been mind-boggling. I thought about this too, like the hipster farmers of 2010s as I was working on this, and people suddenly in Brooklyn or elsewhere decided they wanted to raise chickens for a few eggs. I do wonder what these farmers would have thought of that idea.
The hipster farmers. That's funny because I think just the other day I was at a Jewish event and someone was telling me how they were raising some chickens in their backyard and really enjoying them. Not it was more like hobbyists, I think, just like they have your own chickens and your own eggs. But what do you think, based on some of these experiences, if someone wants to keep some chickens, what would your advice be?
Well, it's very different to have thousands of chickens in a coop versus having a couple of chickens in your backyard. But it did seem even in that era, 10 or 20 years ago, people would buy chickens and so many of them found them. It could be very unpleasant. The chickens could be unpleasant or the experience, and they gave up. It's not necessarily economical. You're not going to get a good deal off of your eggs necessarily, given the costs involving raising chickens. So, but I'm, again, far beyond my expertise to advise or not about whether to buy a few hens.
Yeah. Did your grandparents cook a lot of chicken?
Oh yeah. I mean, on the farm, it's especially as times got bad. It's not a joke. I mean, people would have to eat eggs three times a day. They couldn't afford other food. My grandparents on the joint farm, and then individually, my grandmother, they fried the chicken, they boiled the chicken, every imaginable way to cook a chicken. I still cook my grandmother's chicken soup recipe. I made it for my son the other week when he wasn't feeling well. So I guess that's one legacy of our chicken farming family.
The chicken soup. What makes the recipe special? Can you divulge a little family secret? Or?
Oh, I don't know if it's my first job, I was a reporter at the Christian Science Monitor, and I wrote an article about her chicken soup recipe. So it's hardly a secret. She recommended leeks, carrots, onions, parsnip, dill, and parsley. And she always recommended you sort of put the chicken in first, boil it a little, and it gets rid of some of the stuff, comes to the surface. You dump that water, and then you start over. So that was sort of her advice. And when I first started cooking it, I'd always call her for her to walk me through it. So, but then by now I know it by heart. I don't need the recipe.
That's special. And you mentioned, you mentioned earlier that some of these chickens they would sort of end their lives at like a kosher slaughterhouse, right? Like the farmers would.
Not necessarily in that era. A lot of the chickens ended up at Campbell's. So Campbell, the soup company, was based in Camden, in South Jersey. And so as the chickens aged, and I don't mean aged in the sense of were sick, but they were no longer laying eggs. A lot of the chickens might wind up at a place like Campbell's. So that was one end for them.
Right. The chicken economy being like, once they age out of their prime egg laying time, you sell them off because you don't want to keep an eggless chicken, taking a valuable space on your farm, right?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest expense was the feed. It was expensive the price supports. It's a piece of the story I tell, but the government kept propping up the price of feed, but not the price of chickens and eggs. So the feed and sort of just paying the feed man was your biggest stressor, and you were constantly in debt. So yeah, you did not want a chicken sitting around. You didn't have a lot of sense of just sort of any sort of loyalty to the chicken once they weren't laying eggs anymore.
Definitely not a career path for vegetarians, as it seems. We have just a few minutes left. I'll just have a reminder that if anyone wants to ask any questions to Seth, drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get to a few. But I'm wondering, like, why haven't we heard really the stories of these Jewish poultry farmers before? I mean, in the chat, we can see there's so many people who have these connections, their families had farms, whatever. It seems like such a fun and unique, maybe not fun, maybe the people involved wouldn't have called it fun, but it's a unique story of sort of what happened to survivors. Why hasn't it been told?
So there have been, but I don't want to claim I'm the first person. I'm certainly not the first person to write about Jewish farmers or small town Jewish life. There have been stories, books written, and they're on the shelf behind me, about the Petaluma, California Jewish farming community. There were Jewish farming communities, for instance, in Farmingdale, New Jersey, and Toms River. So there have been books about that. The story that hadn't been told is sort of focused specifically on the survivor experience, the post-war refugees. That's the focus here, and this concentration, the unique concentration who settled in South Jersey. So I think that's a story that hadn't been told. I do hope that people, find it an interesting story. I think it's little known. I certainly think it's fascinating, or I wouldn't have worked on it for 20 years. I hope people learn something about this sort of alternative path for American Jews and these displaced persons in particular, and learn something about what I think about as sort of the mosaic of survivors, that they weren't all the same, and they had very different experiences even when they came here.
Yeah. What are some of the big lessons that you take away from this story that you're even, taking with you?
I think that's really the biggest, is that I think there's a tendency perhaps to typecast the Holocaust survivors, whether it's as they were all damaged and ruined, or they all were a story of overcoming hurdles, and it's not one or the other. It's sort of all of the above. And there was variation in how they coped, and what they told their children, and how religiously observant they were, and how successful they were in this country. I mean, my grandparents didn't have tremendous success on the farm and afterward as small business people. Others of their generation who had been farmers in Vineland had tremendous success, and that doesn't necessarily mean their children didn't have great success. So the trajectory, I don't think it necessarily was an impediment to their success going to farms. I'm not a social scientist, but I don't think there was like a difference in outcome urban Jew, rural Jew for the survivors, but I don't have evidence one way or the other.
Mm. We did have a question about what synagogues these farmers were attending. Was there, were there freestanding synagogues in Vineland, or were they meeting in people's homes? Like, can you kind of tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there were some establishment, I would call them, synagogues that predated, some of them dating back to the early 1900s, that were already in existence. The survivors, they tended to, just like the German Jews before them, sort of started their own small shuls, and the survivors did the same. And so they had these Stiebler. So there were a number of those. Some of the survivors went to the establishment synagogue. So it just depended on individual preference. But by and large, they tended to stay amongst themselves. And that was typical in their social lives and their religious life. The German Jews liked to pray in German. The Eastern European Jews had their own ways of praying, and they sort of sorted amongst themselves.
Wonderful. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating chat. I'm so happy that we got to do this. For those who want to send this talk to friends, I believe the video will be archived. It will be available through 70 Faces Media, various channels. We're going to share one more time a link to buy Seth's book in the chat, and I'm sure he'll be happy to provide his contact info for people who want to tell him about their family stories. Right? How can people get in touch with you?
Well, my Facebook book page is facebook.com/Yiddish to chickens, or Yiddish to chickens@gmail.com. So either way, or find me on Twitter or anywhere else, I'm happy to talk, or if you're interested in trying to find your own family's history in as a survivor farmer family, I'm also happy to point you in the right directions.
Oh, that'd be great. I'm sure you'll get a ton of interested parties here. People are sharing stories of their family farms from coast to coast. So this has been wonderful. I want to thank Seth one more time. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And all right, well,
and thank you again for hosting.
Thank you.